The small town of Millfield had always been a quiet, peaceful place. Nestled in the valley, surrounded by tall pines and dense forests, it seemed like the perfect haven. People went about their daily lives, farmers worked their land, and the children played in the fields with laughter ringing through the air. There was never anything to worry about in Millfield until now. It started subtly with strange noises at night. At first, no one paid much attention to it. The sounds of footsteps in empty houses, doors creaking open on their own, whispers in the wind. The townspeople tried to convince themselves it was just the wind, the house settling, maybe even some animals in the woods. But deep down, something was wrong. And then things escalated. Jenna Collins, a schoolteacher in the town, was the first to experience the full extent of the terror. One evening, as she sat in her living room, reading a book by the fire, the air grew inexplicably cold. The warmth of the flames seemed to vanish, replaced by a chilling draft that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper. Jenna. Her name echoed softly in the room, but there was no one there. She glanced around, her heart pounding in her chest. The fire crackled as if to mock her growing fear, but everything else was still. Her breath became shallow as the whispering grew louder, clearer. Jenna, come closer. A cold, invisible hand seemed to reach out from the shadows, brushing against her skin. She jerked back, her mind racing. Who was there? What was going on? Her heart skipped a beat when the voice whispered again, this time from right behind her ear. She spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty, silent room. Panicking, Jenna grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend, Sarah. Took 3 rings before Sarah picked up, sounding groggy. Jenna? It's late. What's wrong? Jenna's voice trembled as she spoke. Sarah, I don't know what's happening. There's something here, something I can't see, but I can feel it. I keep hearing these whispers, and it's like it's trying to get me. What is going on? Sarah's voice was steady but concerned. Maybe you're just tired. It's been a long week, Jenna. Maybe you're imagining things, but Jenna knew this wasn't imagination. She could feel it. The fear, the pressure in the air, it wasn't normal. I don't know, Sarah. Feels real. And it's not just me. Others have heard it too. People in town. They've been experiencing strange things. Sarah's voice grew more serious. What do you mean, strange things? Jenna took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. I don't know how to explain it, but people are hearing voices. Doors are opening by themselves. Things are being moved around, and no one can figure out why. It's like something invisible is here, and it's terrifying. Before Sarah could respond, a loud crash interrupted their conversation. Jenna screamed, dropping the phone as the sound of something heavy hitting the floor echoed from the other room. Frightened and paralyzed, Jenna slowly got up, her feet trembling as she moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. As she approached the kitchen, she saw it. An entire shelf had fallen to the ground, dishes scattered all over the floor. But there was no one there, no explanation. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her in a terrifying crescendo. Jenna, come to me. She felt the urge to obey, a strange pull that seemed to force her toward the broken shelf. Her mind screamed for her to stop, to turn around, but her body refused to listen. She staggered forward, as if something invisible were guiding her steps. At that moment, her phone rang again, and Jenna snapped out of the trance-like state she was in. She grabbed the phone, desperate to hear a familiar voice. Jenna, are you okay? What happened? What was that noise? Sarah asked, her voice frantic. Jenna could barely speak, her voice shaking. Sarah, I can't explain it. It's here. The thing that's causing all this. It's real." Before Sarah could respond, the power went out. The entire house was plunged into darkness. Panic gripped Jenna's chest as she fumbled for the flashlight in the drawer, her hands trembling uncontrollably. But when the light flickered on, she froze. In the dim beam of the flashlight, she saw it shifting in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light. A shadow, an outline of something or someone. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, it never seemed to take shape. It was just there, moving, watching her. "Jenna?" The voice was close again. Too close. It was in her ear now, chilling her to the bone. The figure began to approach, its presence filling the room, making the air so thick with dread she could barely breathe. The whispering filled her head, the words no longer understandable, just a low hum of fear. Then the figure disappeared. The room was silent once again. But Jenna knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning. She grabbed her phone and dialed Sarah's number again, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Sarah, it's real. Something is here. We need to figure this out before it's too late." But as she spoke, the door to her kitchen slowly creaked open. The next morning, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the unseen entity was still there, lingering in the corners of her home. Every little sound, every creak of the floorboards, made her heart race. She hadn't slept at all, her mind racing with what had happened the night before. Could it be real? Was it just a nightmare? But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She tried to go about her day as usual, pushing the fear to the back of her mind. But the whispering voice from last night echoed in her thoughts, as if it was warning her, telling her that it wasn't over yet. Jenna couldn't help but feel that the entity was getting stronger, and that it was after something more than just scaring her. She decided to visit Sarah, hoping her friend would have some answers. Jenna needed someone to talk to, someone who might understand. Sarah's house wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but the journey there felt like it took hours. As she walked down the empty streets, the silence seemed oppressive, almost suffocating. The town, usually so peaceful, now felt different. The air was thick, heavy with an unspoken tension. Even the trees, their branches swaying in the breeze, seemed to whisper. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath. When Jenna arrived at Sarah's house, her friend greeted her with a worried smile, but there was a noticeable tension in her eyes. Jenna didn't waste any time. "I think it's following me," she said, her voice shaking. "Last night I could feel it. It was in my house, in the room with me. It was watching me. I don't know how to explain it, but I know it's real." Sarah frowned, her concern deepening. "I don't know what's going on, Jenna, but I've been hearing strange things too. My neighbors," she paused, glancing nervously toward the window. "They've been acting weird. People are scared, Jenna. Something's happening in this town. It's like something is pulling us all into its grasp." Jenna's stomach churned. "You've heard the whispers too, haven't you?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, but I thought I was just imagining it. Like, maybe it was just the wind. But now I'm not so sure." Jenna shivered at the thought. The idea that something invisible, something no one could see, was lurking in their town was terrifying. And if Sarah was hearing the whispers too, then the entity was growing stronger. Just then, a loud bang echoed from the back of Sarah's house. Both women froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. It was a sharp, sudden noise, as if something heavy had fallen. "Sarah," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. "What was that?" Sarah's face went pale. "I don't know, but we need to check." They cautiously walked to the back of the house, the silence between them almost unbearable. The air felt colder now, and the once cozy atmosphere of the house felt oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, like it was trying to drown out the whispers that lingered in their ears. As they reached the back room, they stopped dead in their tracks. The door was wide open, and the shelves that had once been neatly organized were now in disarray. Books and pictures were scattered across the floor, as if someone or something had been searching through them. "Did you leave the door open?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. Sarah shook her head. "No, I didn't. I swear." The room felt wrong, as if the very air was thick with dread. They both stepped inside, their eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign of movement, anything that might explain the strange events. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind them. Jenna gasped, spinning around, her breath hitched in her chest. The door was locked, but there was no one there. A low whisper filled the room, sending chills down their spines. "You cannot hide. You are mine." Jenna's eyes widened in terror. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice she had heard the night before, the same voice that had filled her mind with fear. Sarah grabbed her arm, her grip tight and frantic. "We need to get out of here. Now." They rushed to the door, but no matter how hard Sarah pulled on the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door had somehow become stuck, locked from the outside. A cold wind blew through the room, rattling the windows, and the whispers grew louder. It was like a chorus of voices, all chanting the same thing. "You belong to me." Jenna felt her knees weaken as panic set in. "What do we do?" she gasped. "We're trapped." But just as the fear threatened to consume her, she remembered something. The broken shelf from her house. The way the entity had seemed to pull her toward it, as if it was trying to show her something. "Sarah," she said urgently, "we need to find something in here. There's got to be something that can help us." They searched the room frantically, overturning furniture, looking through drawers, but everything felt wrong. The more they searched, the more suffocating the room became. It was like they were being suffocated by the very air itself. Finally, Sarah stumbled upon a small box hidden under the floorboards. It was old, covered in dust, but it felt important. She opened it, and inside was a strange symbol, carved into a piece of wood. Jenna took the symbol in her hand, feeling a strange warmth spread through her fingers. The whispers suddenly stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. But then, the shadows in the room seemed to shift. The air grew even colder, and the door creaked as if something were trying to break through. And in that moment, Jenna realized whatever was haunting their town was not going to stop. It was only just beginning. The night had fallen again, and Jenna couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She could almost feel the weight of it on her shoulders, like an invisible hand hovering over her, just waiting for the moment to strike. It had been 2 days since the strange events at Sarah's house, and nothing had felt right since. She tried to sleep, but every time her eyes closed, she saw flashes of shadows darting around the corners of her room. Every creak of the floorboards sent her heart racing. The whispers were getting louder, now echoing through her mind even when she wasn't near the entity. The town, too, felt different. The once friendly streets were now empty, as if everyone was hiding from something they couldn't explain. The air was thick, suffocating, and even the breeze that usually brought relief felt wrong. Jenna sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes. She had to do something. She couldn't just wait around, hiding from whatever this thing was. She needed answers, and the only place she hadn't yet tried was the old library on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for years, but Jenna had heard stories about it. Strange things happening there, things people didn't like to talk about. That night, she decided to visit. The library was quiet when she arrived, its large wooden doors creaking open as she stepped inside. Dust danced in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. The place smelled of old books and mildew, a heavy, stale air that seemed to cling to her skin. "Hello!" Jenna's voice echoed through the silence, but no one answered. The place felt empty, abandoned. She walked deeper into the library, her footsteps echoing loudly. The shelves, stacked high with old, forgotten books, looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Yet, something about the place felt alive, as if it were waiting for her. Jenna wasn't sure what she was looking for. Some clue, some old story that could explain what was happening to her town. But as she walked, the whispers started again, faint at first, then growing louder. Her heart began to race, the chill of fear creeping up her spine. She turned around quickly, half expecting to see something standing behind her. But there was nothing. The whispers continued, now clearer, now more menacing. "Jenna?" The voice called her name, low and almost soothing, but there was something dark about it. The air felt heavier, suffocating, as if the shadows themselves were closing in on her. She quickly moved toward a large desk at the center of the room, hoping to find something that might explain what was happening. Piles of old papers lay scattered across it, some of them yellowed with age. But it was a book that caught her eye. It was small, bound in worn leather, and when she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. The pages were filled with strange symbols, some of them etched with dark ink, others faded, as if they were written centuries ago. The whispers grew louder, now more urgent. They were all around her, echoing through the room, crawling into her mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Jenna froze, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. Some of the symbols seemed familiar. They were the same ones she had seen on the strange object Sarah had found at her house. Suddenly, the room felt colder. Jenna's breath came in short bursts as she looked around the room, searching for the source of the whispering. There was something in the shadows, something moving. A shape, black, formless, shifted at the far end of the room. Jenna's blood ran cold as she watched it grow larger, slowly advancing toward her. The whispers became louder, a chorus of voices filling her mind. She tried to run, but the shadows were everywhere now, swirling around her like a storm. Her feet felt glued to the floor, her body paralyzed with fear. The whispers became screams, drowning out all other sounds. "Leave, now!" Jenna struggled, her heart pounding in her chest. She finally broke free from the paralysis, turning toward the exit. But as she did, the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. She screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't open. The room around her seemed to close in, the shadows tightening their grip. The whispers were now a deafening roar, impossible to ignore. A cold hand brushed against her shoulder, sending a jolt of ice through her veins. She spun around, but again, there was nothing there, only darkness. The figure from the shadows was now standing before her, its form growing more solid, more real. It was tall, its face hidden in the darkness, its body an endless void of shadow. Its eyes glowed, burning with an unnatural light. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed, its words slithering into her ears like poison. Jenna could feel the coldness of its presence, seeping into her very bones. The terror was overwhelming, paralyzing her once again. But she couldn't give up. She wouldn't. With every ounce of strength she had left, Jenna forced herself to move. She grabbed the book from the desk, holding it tightly in her hands. The shadows seemed to recoil from it, as if the book held power they feared. In a desperate act, she opened the book to the page with the strange symbol. As her fingers brushed over the markings, the room trembled. The shadows hissed in anger, but Jenna didn't stop. She muttered the words written on the page, unsure if they would work, but desperate to try. The shadows shrieked, their voices deafening. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment, the whole library seemed to shake. Suddenly, the room went silent. The shadows vanished, the oppressive feeling lifting. Jenna stood there, gasping for breath, her body shaking from the fear that still gripped her heart. But as she looked around, she realized something was wrong. The library was empty, but the air still felt thick, as if something had followed her home. The whispers were gone, but the terror wasn't. The entity wasn't finished yet. It had only just begun. Jenna couldn't sleep. It had been days since her visit to the library, but the weight of the encounter still hung over her. The air felt heavy, thick with something she couldn't explain. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling that she was never alone remained. The townspeople had started to notice it too. More and more people were reporting strange things happening. Lights flickering, doors slamming shut on their own, objects moving when no one was around. People were scared. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what it was or how to stop it. Jenna couldn't shake the thought that the entity was growing stronger. It had been drawn to the town, and now it was feeding off the fear, becoming more powerful with each passing day. She had to find a way to stop it before it consumed them all. Late one evening, Jenna stood by the window, staring out at the darkened streets. The town looked peaceful, but she knew better. The darkness that had settled over it wasn't just the absence of light. It was something alive, something waiting. She turned away from the window, her heart racing. There was only one place left to go now, one place where the answers might be hidden. The old church on the hill. The building had been abandoned for years, but there were rumors that it had once been the site of strange rituals, things that were best left forgotten. Jenna grabbed her coat, determination filling her chest. She wasn't afraid anymore. The entity had taken enough from her, from the people she loved. She had to put an end to it. The walk to the church was longer than she remembered. The streets were unnaturally quiet. The only sound the crunch of her boots on the gravel. The air grew colder as she neared the hill, the trees around her swaying in the wind, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. When Jenna reached the church, she paused at the gate. The building loomed ahead, its broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. The once beautiful structure was now nothing more than a decaying shell, its walls cracked and covered in vines. Taking a deep breath, Jenna pushed open the creaking gate and made her way up the path to the door. It was locked, but with a small shove, the rotting wood gave way, and she stepped inside. The air inside the church was thick, the smell of mildew mixing with something else, something ancient and foul. The pews were overturned, the altar covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught Jenna's attention was the large stone circle in the center of the room. It was as if the circle had been carved into the floor, but the markings were unfamiliar, twisted in a way that made her stomach churn. She had seen symbols like these before in the book from the library. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped closer, her breath coming out in shallow gasps. The ground beneath her feet seemed to hum with an energy that felt wrong, like it was vibrating with a power that wasn't meant to be here. Then, without warning, the temperature dropped. A cold gust of wind blew through the broken windows, causing the candle on the altar to flicker and go out. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and move, as if they were alive, reaching for her. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, but before she could move any farther, she heard the whisper. "Jenna?" The voice was soft at first, almost gentle, but it grew louder, more urgent, filled with an anger that made her blood run cold. "You should never have come here," it hissed. Jenna spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing behind her. The church was empty, just as it had been when she entered. Yet, the presence was unmistakable, pressing in on her, suffocating her. The ground beneath her feet shook, and the stone circle began to glow, faint lines of light appearing where the symbols were carved. The whispers grew louder, now all around her, echoing off the walls, filling her head with 1,000 voices. "You cannot stop me," the voice growled, its tone dripping with malice. "I am everywhere." Jenna felt the air around her grow thick, her chest tightening as if the very walls were closing in. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here, not with this thing surrounding her. As she turned toward the door, she felt a cold hand grab her wrist. She screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The grip tightened, pulling her back into the center of the room. She tried to fight, to free herself, but the shadows were too strong. They wrapped around her like chains, dragging her toward the glowing circle. "You will be mine," the voice whispered again, louder than ever, filling her ears, her mind. There is no escape. Jenna's heart raced as she struggled to break free, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, their hold on her too powerful. Then, just as it seemed like all hope was lost, something strange happened. The circle of light flickered, dimmed, and for a brief moment, the whispers stopped. The shadows froze in place, as if waiting. In that stillness, Jenna saw it, the symbol in the center of the circle. She recognized it now. It was the same symbol that had been on the book from the library. The same symbol that had appeared on the strange object Sarah had found. She knew what she had to do. With every ounce of strength she had left, Jenna reached into her pocket and pulled out the book. She flipped it open, the pages turning quickly, the symbols on the page glowing faintly in the dim light. She found the symbol she needed. Without hesitation, she shouted the words aloud, her voice echoing through the church. The ground trembled, the shadows screamed, and the air grew cold once more. Jenna's body was shaking, but she kept speaking, the words tumbling from her lips faster and faster. The circle of light exploded in a burst of energy, sending Jenna flying backward. She hit the ground hard, but as she looked up, she saw the shadows unraveling, the entity's grip weakening. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. Jenna's heart hammered in her chest as she lay on the cold stone floor of the church. The echoes of the explosion still rang in her ears, the air thick with the smell of dust and burned wood. She could feel the weight of the darkness lifting, but just for a moment. The shadows seemed to hesitate, as if they were regrouping. She struggled to stand, her body weak and trembling. Her mind raced, the words she had spoken, the power they had carried, still echoing in her thoughts. Had it worked? Had she stopped the entity? Or was this just the calm before the storm? The church was eerily quiet now, the shadows hanging in the corners of the room, but no longer alive, no longer moving. She slowly rose to her feet, her legs shaky. There was no sound, no wind, no whispers, nothing. But something was wrong. The light from the broken windows cast long, twisted shadows on the floor. And as Jenna looked around, she realized that the shadows were waiting, watching. The silence felt oppressive, thick, as if the church itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. She felt it then, a sudden chill, colder than any wind she had ever known. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the altar. The air around her grew heavier, almost suffocating. Then she heard it, a low guttural growl, a sound so deep it seemed to come from the very ground beneath her feet. The shadows twitched, as if they were alive, moving again. Jenna's pulse quickened. The entity wasn't gone. It was still here, lurking, waiting for its chance to strike. The growl came again, louder this time, and the floor beneath her trembled. She backed away, her eyes wide with fear, but her feet wouldn't move fast enough. The ground cracked open in front of her, splitting like an earthquake, and from the darkened void beneath, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. Jenna froze, her body paralyzed with terror. The eyes were empty, black, and they seemed to be looking straight into her soul. She could feel them, burrowing into her mind, invading her thoughts. "Jenna," the voice whispered again. "You can't escape me." It was the same voice from before, but now it was stronger, more powerful, and more insistent. The shadows around her began to writhe, pulling toward the crack in the floor, their tendrils stretching like dark fingers, reaching for her. Her heart raced. She had to do something. She had to move, but fear held her in place. "Please," she whispered to herself. "Not again." But the crack in the floor widened, and the figure from the darkness began to emerge. It was no longer just a shadow. It had shape. It had form. The creature crawled from the depths, its body shifting and twisting, a terrifying blend of darkness and something else, something human. Its face was a grotesque mockery, twisted and disfigured, but its eyes, those eyes, were the same as before, cold, empty, hungry. And then, as if mocking her, the creature spoke. "I told you you can't stop me. I am the darkness in your mind. I am the fear you carry." Jenna gasped for air, her chest tight, her thoughts clouded by panic. She tried to step back, but her legs gave out, and she fell to the floor. The creature's voice echoed in her head, louder now, reverberating with a deep, unnatural power. "You've only delayed the inevitable. You can't destroy me, Jenna. You are mine. You always have been." Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the creature, helpless. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was real, and it was coming for her. But then something inside her stirred. No, she wouldn't give in. The book. She remembered the pages, the symbols, the words that had caused the shadows to retreat, even if just for a moment. Maybe, just maybe, they were her only hope. She reached into her coat pocket, her hand trembling, and pulled out the book. It felt heavier now, as if the weight of the entity was pressing down on it, but she didn't care. She needed it. With shaky hands, Jenna opened the book, flipping through the pages, searching for the symbol, the words, anything that might help. The creature lunged toward her, its claws extending, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't. Not this time. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to lose. Finally, she found it, the symbol. The same one from the library, the same one that had appeared in the circle. The one she had used before. She didn't hesitate. She shouted the words, her voice hoarse, but steady. She felt the power in them, felt it course through her, just as it had before. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. But then the ground shook again, more violently this time. The walls cracked, and the air grew colder, colder than it had ever been. And then, like before, the shadows screamed, a horrible, deafening sound, as if the very essence of darkness itself was being torn apart. Jenna squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling as the wind howled through the broken church. She could feel the darkness swirling around her, trying to choke her, trying to drown her in its cold embrace. But she pushed back. She kept speaking the words, louder, stronger. The creature screeched, its form beginning to distort and fracture, the darkness unraveling at the seams. And then, with one final scream, the creature exploded in a burst of darkness, the shadows dissipating into nothingness. The crack in the floor sealed itself, the cold air lifting as the church fell silent once more. Jenna stood in the silence, her heart racing, her body drenched in sweat. She felt exhausted, drained, but victorious. For now, at least she had stopped it. But as she turned to leave the church, She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The entity had been powerful, too powerful, and she knew it wouldn't give up so easily. It would be back. The church was silent again, but Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her pulse raced in her ears as she stepped carefully toward the door. The cold air from outside felt like a cruel reminder that the battle was far from over. She glanced back at the altar, her breath still coming in quick, shallow gasps. The shattered walls seemed to watch her, the empty spaces echoing with a quiet menace, as if the shadows were waiting, patient, just beyond her sight. The creature was gone. She could feel that much, but it wasn't truly over. She knew that. There was something deeper, something that lingered in the silence, as if the very walls of the church were holding their breath. Jenna pushed open the door and stepped outside, the chill of the night air biting at her skin. The streets of the town were eerily quiet. No wind, no sound, nothing moved. The street lamps flickered weakly in the distance, casting long shadows on the empty pavement. She tried to steady herself, shaking off the fear that clung to her like a heavy fog. She needed to find the others, to warn them. They had no idea what was coming. What was coming? As she walked down the darkened street, Jenna's mind raced. The creature, if it was even possible to call it that, had been powerful. It had been relentless, and no matter how much she fought, it was clear that the shadows would never fully leave. The darkness had a hold on this town, on her, and nothing she had done could change that. A sharp pain stabbed through her chest, like an invisible weight pressing down on her. She stopped, gripping her heart, trying to catch her breath. The air felt heavier now, thick with something dark and suffocating. "Jenna?" The whisper came from behind her, soft, like a breath on her neck. She spun around, but no one was there. Her heart pounded faster. She wasn't alone. She never had been. The thing, the darkness, it was still here, still following her, watching her. Jenna forced herself to keep walking, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The town was empty now, no signs of life. The shadows in the corners of the buildings seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if they were creeping toward her. The familiar silence of the town had turned into something threatening, something malicious. The darkness was no longer just an entity. It had become a living, breathing thing. And it wasn't just waiting, it was stalking her. She reached the old town square, the place where the rumors had started. The ground was cracked and uneven, the fountain long dry, its stone surface covered in layers of dust. This place had once been full of life, full of laughter, but now it stood silent and desolate, and it felt wrong, like a place that had been abandoned by hope itself. Jenna stopped in front of the fountain, the stone cold beneath her fingers. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. Her breath caught as the air grew colder, and she heard it again. The whisper. This time it was clearer, sharper, and it came from all around her. "You can't hide." She spun around, her heart racing. The darkness was closing in. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching out for her, curling around the edges of her vision. She had to run, had to find a way to escape, but she couldn't move. Her legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the earth. The shadows pressed in on her, suffocating her, and then, suddenly, everything went dark. Her vision blurred, the world spinning around her. Jenna gasped for air, her chest tightening as she fell to her knees. The ground beneath her felt like it was melting, twisting, shifting like a liquid. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold stone of the fountain, but it was too late. A voice rang in her mind, a voice she knew all too well. "I told you, Jenna, you can't escape me." The voice was inside her head now, so close, so real. It wasn't just speaking to her. It was speaking through her. Jenna screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The air thickened again, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The shadows wrapped around her, pulling her down into the cold, suffocating depths. She fought, but the pressure was too much. The shadows were stronger now, more powerful than before, and they were closing in. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the darkness lifted. Jenna's breath came in ragged gasps, her body slick with sweat. She was still kneeling in front of the fountain, the night air cool against her skin. But everything had changed. The shadows were gone. For now, she stood up, her legs weak, and looked around. The town square was still empty, but there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. A figure, standing in the distance, just at the edge of the shadows. Jenna froze, her heart skipping a beat. It was a person, but not just anyone. She recognized the figure instantly. It was Rachel, her friend, her old friend, who had disappeared weeks ago. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes empty, like they had been drained of all life. She was motionless, standing still, her body frozen in place like a statue. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she took a step forward. "Rachel!" Her voice was barely a whisper, but Rachel didn't move. She didn't answer. And then, with a horrible, bone-chilling scream, Rachel's eyes snapped open, revealing nothing but pure darkness. The town had changed, and Jenna knew in that moment that the entity had taken control. It was here now in the heart of the town, and it would never let them go. The night felt heavier as Jenna stared at the figure in front of her. Rachel's pale face, her lifeless eyes, and the way she stood motionless. It was enough to make anyone freeze in terror. But Jenna's mind was racing. This wasn't Rachel. Not anymore. The darkness had claimed her. Jenna had seen this before. People who had been consumed by the shadows. There was no going back. They were gone, changed, and Rachel was no different. Jenna's heart pounded as she took a careful step back. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched Rachel's empty eyes follow her every movement. Jenna didn't want to know what would happen if she got too close, but her legs wouldn't listen. She couldn't stop herself from moving forward, inch by inch, toward her friend. "Rachel!" Her voice trembled, barely a whisper in the cold air. For a moment, nothing happened. Rachel remained still, her eyes fixed on Jenna, unblinking. And then, as if snapping out of a trance, Rachel's mouth opened wide. The sound that came out was not human. It was a screech, so sharp and high-pitched that it made Jenna's ears ring. The scream echoed through the town square, rattling the walls of the empty buildings, sending birds flying into the sky in a frenzy. Jenna's blood ran cold. She turned on her heels and ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The streets blurred past her as she sprinted, her footsteps pounding against the cracked pavement. The town, which had once been quiet and peaceful, now felt like a maze of shadows, twisting and turning, pulling her deeper into its grip. Every corner, every alley, felt like it was closing in on her. The cold air felt sharp against her skin, but it wasn't enough to cool the fire of panic in her chest. She needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere she could hide, somewhere she could figure out how to stop the nightmare that had taken over this town. Jenna's eyes darted around, desperate for any sign of life, but the streets remained empty. No one was out, not a soul to help, not a single person to fight back. She ran past the old school, the windows dark and empty. The church was further up the road, the front door cracked open, but she didn't dare go back inside. The darkness that had come from that place had followed her. It had followed them all, and it was only growing stronger. Suddenly, she stopped. A figure stepped out of the shadows in front of her. A man, tall and thin, his face covered by a dark hood. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But Jenna could feel the presence. Something dark and ancient radiated from him, like a cold wind that chilled her to the bone. She took a step back, instinctively pulling away. "Who are you?" Her voice was sharp, though her hands shook. The man didn't answer. He raised a hand, pointing directly at her. A chill ran down her spine as she saw the thin lines of shadows gather in his outstretched fingers. Without warning, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The pavement cracked and split open like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. "No, no!" Jenna shouted, stumbling backward. Her heart raced, and her breath came in ragged gasps. The man's cold gaze never wavered. He took a step forward, the shadows swirling around him. Jenna's instincts kicked in. She turned and ran once again, the streets now a blur of terror. Her legs burned, but the darkness behind her was closer. It was following her, and it wasn't stopping. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing nothing but a shifting, twisting cloud of black. It was everywhere, surrounding her, closing in, suffocating the air with its evil presence. Her footsteps faltered as she turned another corner, barely catching her breath. She was close to the old woods now, the forest that bordered the town. If she could make it there, maybe she could find shelter. But even that seemed impossible. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure moving in the distance. Another shadow, another person, lost to the darkness. Jenna's mind raced, panic clawing at her chest. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself get caught. But then, she felt it. The cold that had been following her, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. It was no longer just behind her. It was all around her now. The shadows moved with a mind of their own, stretching and twisting. She could feel them crawling up her legs, pulling at her. She screamed, trying to shake them off, but they were everywhere. "Help!" Jenna's voice cracked as she struggled, but no one came. The streets were empty. The shadows closed in tighter, pulling her into the darkness. The air was thick, the pressure suffocating. Her body felt heavy, like it was being pulled toward the ground. She tried to scream again, but the words were trapped in her throat. Suddenly, everything went silent. Jenna opened her eyes, the world around her strangely still. The shadows had stopped. The ground beneath her feet was solid again. But it wasn't over. Jenna looked up, and there, in the distance, she saw it. A figure, standing alone in the middle of the street. The hooded man. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, through the veil of darkness, Jenna could see hundreds of shapes. More figures, more shadows, more people lost to the curse. They were all moving toward her, slowly, steadily, with a single purpose. And she knew deep down that it was only the beginning. The town was lost, and she was the only one who could stop it. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as she stumbled down the dark, narrow alleyway. The shadows that had once seemed like distant threats were now closing in on her, relentless and suffocating. The air was thick with a cold that seeped into her bones, and every step she took felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to drag her under. She glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see the hooded man and the dark figures chasing her. But the street behind her was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. She could almost hear their whispers in the wind, cold voices calling her name, promising her a fate worse than death. She quickened her pace, her feet slipping on the wet pavement. The trees ahead, the ones bordering the old woods, loomed like dark sentinels. The forest was her only chance, the only place left that might offer some escape. If she could make it to the heart of the woods, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to stop this nightmare. But with every step she took, the darkness followed. She could feel it, pressing in on her, whispering to her, mocking her every attempt to outrun it. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, like it was alive, pulling her back. She stumbled, barely catching herself against a rusted metal fence. A cold breeze brushed past her, and for a moment, she thought she heard a familiar voice, soft and pleading. "Jenna, please help me." Her breath hitched. It was Rachel. But no, it couldn't be. Rachel was lost to the shadows. The darkness had taken her. This wasn't her friend anymore. Jenna shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. The fear was too much. She couldn't let it break her. She had to keep moving. The forest was close now, the trees towering above her, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The moment she stepped into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the air became thick, almost suffocating. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware of her presence. Jenna took a deep breath and pushed forward, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet the only sound in the stillness. She could barely see the path in front of her, the darkness so thick that it seemed to swallow everything. Her hands trembled, and she gripped a branch for support as she continued deeper into the woods. The silence was oppressive. Felt like the entire world had fallen silent, holding its breath. Jenna's mind raced, every step taking her further away from the safety of the town, deeper into the unknown. And then, she heard it, a low, guttural growl. The sound echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, so deep that it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Jenna froze, her breath catching in her throat. The growl was followed by a rustling noise, like something, or someone, moving through the underbrush. Jenna's pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. Something was out there, something watching her. She started to turn, but then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing ahead. It was tall, its outline dark against the faint moonlight. Jenna's blood ran cold. The figure wasn't moving, but it felt like it was watching her, waiting. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead, rooted to the ground. "Who are you?" Jenna's voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling with fear. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its presence heavy, like a shadow that stretched across the entire forest. And then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. Jenna's heart skipped a beat. She turned and ran. The branches tore at her skin. The underbrush tangled around her feet, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let whatever was out there catch her. She couldn't let the darkness win. The growl came again, closer this time, and Jenna's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed forward, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind her. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees pressing together, blocking her way. She had nowhere to go. And then, through the trees, she saw it. The clearing ahead. The old church. She didn't hesitate. She ran toward it, the ancient building rising up from the ground like a silent guardian, its stone walls weathered by time. The door was ajar, as if waiting for her. Jenna reached the door, her hands shaking as she pushed it open. She stepped inside, the cold air of the church surrounding her. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. The moment she entered, she heard it, a low, almost inaudible whisper, coming from the darkness of the church. "You shouldn't have come here." Jenna froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't alone. There was something in the church with her. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. She backed away toward the altar, her mind racing. What had she walked into? What was this place? The whispers grew louder, filling the space around her, wrapping around her like a vice. And then, From the shadows, a figure emerged. A woman, her face hidden in darkness, her voice a whisper on the wind. "You cannot hide from the truth, Jenna. It will find you." Jenna's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The figure stepped closer, and as the moonlight hit her face, Jenna gasped. It was Rachel, but Rachel wasn't Rachel anymore. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her lips curled into a twisted smile, and the darkness around her seemed to pulse and writhe. "Help me." Rachel's voice was faint, almost as if she were speaking from far away. "You have to help me." Jenna's heart shattered. She stepped forward, but something inside her screamed to stop. This wasn't Rachel. Couldn't be. The darkness around them thickened, and the room seemed to close in on Jenna. She turned, desperate to escape, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside the church. The shadows were closing in, and Jenna knew with a cold certainty that the hunt wasn't over yet. Jenna's hands trembled as she backed away from the shadowy figure that looked like Rachel. The church was eerily silent now, except for the soft, distant echo of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The air felt thick, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Rachel, or whatever it was, wasn't moving. Her eyes, hollow and dark, stared at Jenna with an empty, soul-piercing gaze. It was like looking into the abyss, and Jenna felt herself sinking into it. Every inch of her skin screamed to run, but her legs were frozen, like she was trapped in the very air around her. "Rachel," Jenna whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "What happened to you? What is this?" The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, smiling with that twisted, unnatural grin. The darkness seemed to crawl around her, swirling like smoke, getting thicker, closer, and more suffocating with each passing second. Jenna's pulse quickened. She couldn't stay here. She needed to escape. But the moment she turned toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. The noise shook the old church, the walls trembling as if the building itself were alive. "Let me out!" Jenna screamed, rushing to the door and pushing against it with all her strength. But it wouldn't budge. She turned back toward the figure, but it was gone. In its place, the shadows had deepened, spreading like a thick blanket across the room. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. "Jenna, come closer." The voice wasn't Rachel's. It was deeper, darker. It felt like it came from everywhere, surrounding her, filling her ears with chilling words. She backed away, her eyes scanning the room in a panic. The stained glass windows let in just enough moonlight to cast strange, twisted shadows on the walls. Shapes moved within the darkness, dancing and shifting. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. It was like something was waiting, watching, and it was getting closer with every passing second. Her mind raced. She had to think. What could she do? What was this place? The whispers grew louder, and suddenly, a cold hand brushed her shoulder. Jenna screamed, spinning around to face it, but there was nothing there, just empty air. The room seemed to close in around her. The shadows stretched toward her like fingers, pulling her in. And then, she heard it, a slow, creaking sound, coming from the altar. Jenna's heart skipped a beat as her eyes locked onto the altar, where the dark figure of a man stood, silhouetted against the flickering candlelight. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching her. His face was hidden in the shadows, but there was something about him, something that felt ancient and evil. Jenna's legs shook as she took a step back, every instinct telling her to run. But her feet wouldn't move. She couldn't look away. The man finally spoke, his voice low and rasping. "You should have never come here, Jenna. The darkness is already inside you. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. What are you talking about? What do you want from me? The man stepped forward, his silhouette shifting in the dim light. He was tall, his figure impossibly thin, like a shadow made of flesh. The entity, it feeds on fear, and you're full of it. Jenna felt her stomach drop. Fear? But she wasn't afraid. At least she hadn't been. But now, she realized with a sickening lurch, she had been running from something so much deeper, so much darker than she had ever imagined. And it had been following her all along. She tried to run, but the ground beneath her feet shifted, as if the very earth was moving with her. The shadows stretched out, grabbing at her ankles, pulling her back toward the altar. No! Stop! Jenna screamed, struggling against the force that held her. But it was no use. The darkness was too strong. She was being dragged closer and closer to the altar, toward the figure that stood waiting. As she neared him, his face finally came into view, twisted and distorted, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. A crooked smile twisted his lips. "This is where you belong," he whispered, his voice like cold ice. "You're part of the darkness now, Jenna. Forever." The shadows closed in around her, and Jenna's scream was lost in the deafening silence that followed. The church seemed to swallow her whole, her body becoming part of the darkness itself. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, the weight of centuries of secrets, and the haunting presence of the thing that had been waiting for her. And in that moment, Jenna understood. The entity wasn't just something outside of her. It was inside her. It always had been. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides, its cold, suffocating grip tightening around her. Her breath came in short, frantic gasps, but no matter how hard she tried to move, it felt like the ground itself was holding her in place. The shadows were everywhere now. They swirled around her, reaching out like twisted hands, crawling along the floor, up the walls and into the air. They whispered in her ear, their voices soft, insistent, like the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But every word sent a chill through her bones. "Jenna," the voices hissed, as if the darkness itself were calling her name. "You can't escape." She could see the figure now, the tall, thin man from before. His shadow stretched long across the floor, his twisted face still hidden in darkness. He didn't move, but she could feel his eyes on her, like they were burning into her very soul. She couldn't look away, no matter how much she wanted to. The pull of the shadows, the pull of his presence was too strong. The room was closing in, the walls shifting, warping, as though they were alive. Jenna's legs were shaking, her body trembling with fear, but her feet wouldn't move. She could feel the air growing colder, the darkness growing deeper. "Why?" Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" The figure stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. The smile on his face was twisted, almost mocking, as if he were savoring her fear. "Because you're one of us now," he said, his voice low and rasping, like something scraping against stone. "The curse has already taken root." Jenna's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of his words, the truth behind them. Something inside her had been changing ever since she stepped foot in this cursed town. Something she couldn't escape. It was in the air, in the walls, in the very ground beneath her. The darkness had already claimed her. "You were never meant to survive this," he continued, his voice growing softer. "The moment you arrived, the curse marked you. There is no turning back." "No." Jenna shook her head, trying to hold on to something, anything that made sense. "I don't believe you. I can still fight this. I can still stop it." The figure chuckled, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the room. You think you can fight it? You are already part of it. The entity is inside you now. It's always been inside you. Jenna stumbled back, her mind racing. No, she couldn't believe that. There had to be some way out of this. But as she looked around the room, she saw the shadows shifting again. They were moving closer, creeping toward her like they were alive. She could feel their cold fingers brushing against her skin, their whispers becoming louder, more urgent. Suddenly, the man's face came into focus. His eyes were dark, empty voids, like two pits of nothingness. He was no longer standing still. He was right in front of her, his face inches from hers, his breath cold against her skin. "Why fight?" he whispered. "This is your fate." Jenna could feel the darkness closing in on her, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It was like the air itself was too thick to breathe. The terror was overwhelming, suffocating, and for a moment, she wanted to give up. She wanted to close her eyes, to let the darkness take her. It was easier that way. It was always easier to let go. But deep inside her, something flickered, a spark of defiance. She couldn't give in. Not yet. "No," Jenna whispered again, her voice stronger this time. "I won't let you win." She closed her eyes, pushing the fear down, forcing herself to take a deep breath. There had to be a way out. There had to be something she could do. The darkness was inside her, but it didn't control her. She wasn't going to let it. Jenna opened her eyes and looked around the room. Her gaze landed on the altar, where the dark figure had stood before. It was still there, but now it looked different. The shadows around it were thickening, swirling, almost like they were alive. Jenna could feel the pull, the weight of it calling to her, but she didn't move. She took another step back, then another, her legs weak beneath her, but she couldn't stop. She was drawn toward the altar, pulled by something she couldn't explain. The closer she got, the colder the air became, until it was like walking through ice. Then she saw it. The artifact. It was there, hidden beneath the altar, half covered in dark cloth. She could feel it calling to her, like a faint pulse, like a heartbeat. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be the key to breaking the curse? Jenna reached out, her hand trembling as she grabbed the cloth and pulled it away. The moment the cloth fell, a sharp, blinding light filled the room. The shadows shrieked, recoiling in pain, but it was too late. The light grew brighter, stronger, and for the first time since she entered this cursed church, Jenna felt a sense of hope. The figure, the man screamed, his voice full of rage, but it didn't stop the light. It was like the light was purging the darkness, driving it away. Jenna didn't look back. She knew this was her chance, her only chance. She pushed forward, her hand still gripping the artifact, feeling its power surging through her, burning away the shadows. The room was shifting, the walls groaning, but she kept moving. And then, with one final, desperate push, she threw the artifact into the air. The light exploded. Jenna could feel the light surrounding her, like a shield pushing back the darkness. It wasn't just a flash. It was a burning, pulsing warmth that wrapped around her like a protective cloak. For the first time since entering the cursed town, Jenna felt a sense of peace. But she knew it wasn't over. The shadows, the entity, they would come back. The light wasn't enough to banish them forever. Her hands trembled as she gripped the artifact, its power still pulsing through her. The shadows shrieked in fury, swirling around her, but the light pushed them back. She couldn't hear their whispers anymore. They were quiet, as though they feared the light too. But she knew they were still there, waiting, watching. Jenna turned and ran towards the church's exit. Her legs were weak, but the light in her hands made her feel stronger. Every step felt like she was walking through a storm, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't look back. When she reached the door, the light flickered. For a moment, she thought it would go out, but then it flared brightly, stronger than ever. Not yet, she whispered to herself, her heart pounding. She had to get out. She had to leave before it was too late. As the door creaked open, Jenna stumbled out into the night air. It was cold, but the air felt refreshing against her skin. She could still feel the dark presence behind her, but it was fading. Slowly, Jenna didn't stop. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The town was silent now, the streets empty, but she could still feel the weight of the curse hanging in the air. And then, she heard it. The whispering. The voices, soft and insistent, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. They were back. Jenna? She froze. The darkness had followed her. She turned, but there was nothing there. Just the empty streets and the flickering lights above. And then she saw it. A figure standing at the end of the street, barely visible in the shadows. It was the same man, the dark figure that had haunted her. His face was hidden, but his presence was unmistakable. "You can't escape," the voice said, low and cold. "The curse is inside you. You will never be free." Jenna's heart skipped a beat. She had thought she was safe, but the entity was still here, waiting, watching. "You'll never be able to outrun it," the figure continued. "It will always be with you." Jenna took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let it win. She couldn't. With one last glance at the figure, Jenna turned and ran again, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she could outrun the curse, but she had to try. She couldn't let the darkness claim her. Jenna ran through the empty streets, her breath ragged and her legs aching, but she didn't dare slow down. The whispering was getting louder, more insistent, like the shadows were closing in on her. She could hear them, feel them, even though she didn't dare look back. She couldn't go back to the church. That was where it had all started. The entity, the darkness, the curse. She had to find a way to end it. Her mind raced. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help, someone who knew how to stop this thing for good. The town was silent, but she could still feel the eyes of the shadows watching her, waiting for her to break. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep running. Every corner she turned, every street she passed, felt like it was closing in on her. Suddenly, she remembered something. Something her grandmother had told her when she was a little girl. There was a place, an old cabin in the woods, hidden away from the rest of the town. It was a place where people went when they needed to escape the darkness. A place where the curse could be broken. She didn't know if it was true, but it was her only chance. Jenna took a sharp left, heading for the woods. The trees loomed ahead, dark and twisted, but she couldn't stop. She didn't have time to think. She had to reach the cabin. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now. She could feel the presence of the entity closing in on her, its cold fingers brushing against her skin, trying to pull her back into the darkness. She had to fight it. Finally, she reached the cabin. It was small, weathered, but standing strong, untouched by time. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was thick, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. It was dark, but there was something comforting about it. Felt safe, like a refuge from the nightmare outside. Jenna's hands shook as she set the artifact down on the old wooden table in the center of the room. She could feel the entity's presence still, just outside the cabin, watching her. The whispers were getting louder, more frantic. Jenna closed her eyes, trying to block them out. She had to focus. She had to end this. She reached for the artifact again. her fingers trembling as she grasped it tightly. She could feel its power coursing through her, its warmth spreading through her veins. This was it. This was her chance. With one final, determined breath, Jenna whispered the words her grandmother had told her. "I release you. I free myself." The moment the words left her lips, the room shook. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the air crackled with energy. The shadows outside screeched in fury, but it was too late. The light from the artifact flared brighter than ever, filling the room with a blinding, purifying glow. The darkness screamed, but it couldn't escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness was gone. The whispers stopped. The air was still. Jenna stood there, breathing heavily, her heart racing. It was over. The curse had been broken. The silence in the cabin was peaceful now. Jenna sank to her knees, tears of relief streaming down her face. She had done it. She had survived. But as she looked around the room, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The door creaked open. Jenna's heart stopped. The door creaked open slowly, like something was pushing it from the other side. The silence that had filled the room now felt suffocating, as though the world was holding its breath. She stood frozen, her mind racing, her breath shallow. Could it be? Could the entity still be there, waiting for its chance to strike again? The door swung open fully, revealing nothing but the empty woods outside. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as she took a cautious step forward, her eyes darting to the darkness beyond. But there was no sign of the entity, no shadow lurking, no whispering voices. She felt free. It was over. The curse had been broken. She had defeated the darkness. Jenna stepped outside, the night air cool and fresh against her skin. The town, once haunted by the terror of the unseen entity, was quiet. The curse had lifted, leaving nothing but the empty streets and the silent trees. As she walked away from the cabin, Jenna looked back one last time. The darkness was gone, and the town was safe. The nightmare was over. But as she walked into the distance, a faint whisper echoed in her mind. "Remember, Jenna?" She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "Remember?" The voice was soft, distant, but unmistakable. And for the first time in a long time, Jenna smiled.